Everybody. How did I fall into this talk? How did I end up with Shetland Lace? When we were working out what to do for the year, I somehow ended up with Shetland Lace. I think it was because I thought I might know a little bit about it. Though having done lots of research, I realised, although I did know quite a bit about it, there was plenty that I didn't know. It was really interesting to delve into some of the social history behind Shetland Lace and to find out just how young Shetland Lace is. That Mary did a talk a few months ago about Orenburg lace, and that dated back to the 18th century, didn't it?
Yes.
From what I remember,
yes,
well
yes.
back into the 18th century. And Shetland Lace comes actually much later that Shetland Lace began. I was surprised by that because of this. Oh, could you turn the lights out, Joe? I'm sorry to everybody that's knitting, but that's better, isn't it? That's better. Because of where the Shetlands are. Can you see the right between Scotland and that's Norway up to the right hand side? And we've got a little rectangle around the Shetland Islands there. There's some islands between the Shetlands and Scotland. Those ones that are nearest to Scotland are the Orkneys, and then up top left are the Faroe Islands. So that's the different groups of islands, all of which have their own knitted lace traditions. But the Shetlands, it's right in the bang in the middle of lots of shipping routes, so I would have expected it to have started knitting lace a lot earlier than it did actually. It wasn't until apparently the 1830s. Now this is from what I've learned from Richard Rutt, because Barbara very kindly passed on to me an extra copy of Richard Rutt's History of Knitting, his book The History of Knitting, from which I found this out. So this was reported from that time. Somebody reported this history that witnessed it, that was part of it. In the 1830s, Mrs. Ogilvie, who was a Shetlander, received from somebody somewhere on the mainland, in mainland Britain, received a christening cap, a lace christening cap for her son. Possibly like this christening cap that's shown on the right hand side here, which is an early lace christening cap from one of those, I think it might even be from Jane Gogan's book. It's from one of those very early knitting books. So possibly something like that one on the right hand side there. So she received this lace christening cap. Can you see it's got an edging on it? It's got a star lace in the top, this one, and there's some, looks a bit like faggoting kind of stitch going around the top of the cap next to the crown. And from that cap, a lady, a friend of Mrs. Ogilvie's in Shetland, copied some of the lace pattern to make some fine woolen mitts. And then she also made, the same lady that made the fine woolen mitts, copied from this cap, she also then made an invalid cap for Mr. Frederick Dundas, who lived in Lerry. He suggested to his landlady that it would be a good idea for some of the poor Shetland ladies to start knitting lace items for trade, that this is something that they could do to supplement their meagre incomes. Because at that time, and forever after, people in Shetland were typically very poor. They eked out an existence on their crops. They had very little money. It was a really grim life for people living in Shetland at that time. However, they didn't really start doing that straight away. Very soon after this, he had his idea, Mr. Dundas's trade idea. Mr. Edward Standen suggested the same thing to his landlady. The difference being that Mr. Edward Standen was already trading in knitted goods. He traded in hosiery, that is, stockings. And he started then to also trade in knitted lace shawls. In London, he introduced Shetland Lace shawls to the London market. So the trade in Shetland Lace, knitted Shetland Lace, really began with Mr. Edward Standen. Up until this time, they had already been trading knitted goods from Shetland, typically socks and caps and knitted gloves, the kind of things that lots of other parts of Britain and in fact parts of Europe people were making in lots of rural parts of Europe and Britain for trade. For example, our Yorkshire knitters, you know, the Yorkshire Dales knitters at this time were knitting gloves and socks for trade. It had become very difficult to make money from that trade because of the introduction of the knitting frame. So much of the knitted goods that went for sale at that time had now become frame knitted rather than hand knitted, and it was very difficult for hand knitters to actually make money from trading in knitted goods. So they had to branch out, and this was the idea, that by doing fine lace patterns which couldn't be reproduced on the frames the same way, it was a unique selling point for these garments. So that's how it all began in the 1930s, and it very quickly developed into a major trade for the Shetland knitters. From 1840, fine knitted lace shawls were exported from Shetland to Scotland and England, and knitting became a vital source of income for the Shetland knitters. They applied themselves to the production of knitted lace with remarkable diligence and fortitude. Oh, hang on. That wasn't meant to happen. I beg your pardon, I have to go back to it. This is a quote from D. Sutherland. He says, "You see the lower orders busy knitting when putting their way through the marshes with creels on their backs." This is a reference to the fact that the Shetland knitters typically were knitted while they worked, like the Dales knitters did as well, the same way as the Dales knitted. They knitted while they were on the move, like this lady pictured here. There are lots of pictures like this, if you want to go and find them, on the internet, showing Victorian pictures of the Shetland knitters moving around with knitting in their hands, creels on their back, standing together with creels on their back next to carts. Obviously, in the process of their day, just in the busyness of their day, they were knitting. So they were typically knitting, and this is what D. Sutherland said. So in 1846, it was already noted that the Shetland knitters were knitting all the time while they went around their business on their crofts to market, to the town, whatever it was that they were doing in the general business of their day. What did they make? In 1851, the Great Exhibition, you all know about the Great Exhibition in 1851, don't you? A major event in Victorian times. The Great Exhibition included the following hand-knitted items from Shetland. Many of these were lace items. Shawls, handkerchiefs and veils. That's why I've got this lady on the right-hand side wearing a Shetland veil. Gloves, mitts, stockings, knee caps. I take that to mean like a short leg warmer that goes over the knees, is what I imagine a knee cap is. Leggings, nightcaps, wigs, unbelievably, and comforters. I think comforters were like a kind of scarf that covered the stomach as well. What's comforter? Do you know better than that, Barbara?
Well, sometimes it just seems to me
just to know. My understanding was that it was a scarf and that it also provided warmth for the front, the stomach. I must have read that somewhere because that's what's in my head for a comforter, that it provided warmth for the front. The problem for the Shetland knitters was the truck system, the way that they were paid. They weren't paid in actual money. The merchants, all their knitted goods had to go through a merchant. They didn't sell it directly to the public themselves. They produced their knitted goods and they passed them on to a merchant, a trader, typically a shopkeeper in Lerwick, who passed them into the trade for them to be shipped to London, Edinburgh, all the major places. The truck system was actually illegal. From something like 1831, all truck systems were illegal in Britain. Because, believe it or not, back then, there were actually some caring governments who didn't think that people should be exploited and introduced legislation to make sure that people weren't exploited in the UK. That's why the truck system was illegal, because it was actually oppressive. It was an exploitative system. Typically, in the Shetland Islands, the knitters could only get either drapery or tea or things like soap. Tea, soap and shoes and drapery were just about the limit of what they could get for their knitting. They couldn't get money, they could just get that. And then of course their ability to translate that into anything else depended on how much they could barter it, whether they could barter it with their neighbours. And because of that, the truck system tended to work better for the ladies that lived in the more rural areas of the Shetland Islands, because their neighbours were more likely to be prepared to barter for things that they didn't have to go to town for. Whereas the ladies that lived in town, it was much less beneficial to them to be paid via this truck system. Because of this truck system, there was a whole public inquiry in the 1870s, and from that public inquiry, we know quite a bit about the knitting traditions of Shetland because of the actual records from this inquiry in the 1870s, which did show a really negative system. It was barely concealed hostility from the knitters towards the people that they were trading with, because they were treated so badly by them. They would ask to be paid little bits of money for their goods and refused it, told that there wasn't any money to pay them with, and lied to, basically, in a way that oppressed them. It was very negative for them. Oops. So what was the trade worth? A lot of money. You can see the growth of it here. I've spent a hell of a lot of time working with inflation calculators to try and find out what the value of these things was for you. So apparently in 1871, which is at the time of the truck inquiry, the Shetland Lace industry was estimated, the whole industry this is, the value of the finished goods in the marketplace, to the market. The whole industry was worth something like between £10,000 and £12,000 a year. That was already over £1 million worth of value in today's money, which is a heck of a lot of money for an industry in a place like the Shetland Islands. You know, we're talking about a small population really here. In 1893, it had grown to be worth £25,000, so it had doubled in the space of just over 20 years, to nearly £3 million of today's money. In 1910, it had doubled again So it got very, very popular. It was like exponential, the growth of the industry during this period. So it was worth well over £5 million in 1910 in today's money. £50,000 of money back then. And then it started slowly, well, to decline a little bit then in 1920. It just reduced slightly. And I think this is when we saw it, why we saw in the 1920s this switch from Shetland lace, that there was a reduction in the amount of Shetland lace that was knitted, and people switched over to knitting a lot of the Fair Isle garments instead. Remember during the 20s that Fair Isle became very fashionable. So during the 20s, that was the period when there was this switch in what it was that was being produced, in an attempt to save the industry, I suppose. Shetland lace had become less popular because in 1920s shawls had fallen out of fashion. Well, certainly fine lace shawls. Shawls were really most popular during Victorian times. It's something that to this day we still associate really with the Victorians, isn't it?
Which competition did it have from the Irish crochet?
The fine lace, I wonder. I don't know.
So it's just that period, isn't it?
Yeah.
Irish crochet was very similar.
Different things really. I mean, Irish crochet was cotton.
And they were,
whereas Shetland shawls were wool and
yeah,
were really to keep it warm, as well as being decorative.
as well as we, yes. Yeah.
But people still use them for babies. People still use them for babies.
Yes, as christening shawls. I think that's what happened during the 20th century, really, isn't it? Because in Victorian times, most of the fine lace, from what I can gather, it was principally used as a fashion item for fine ladies. Whereas during the 20th century, it became, as you say, something that was more associated with infants. But the knitters were very poorly paid. Can you see that at the bottom? So, and remember, this was in goods. They weren't being paid in money. So the equivalent in money of the goods that they received for their work, it amounted to approximately 3 to 4 pence an hour of money at that time, 3 to 4 pence an hour, which, according to my inflation calculators that I've been using, is equivalent to something in the region of £1.45 to £1.93 in today's money.
Well, nothing's changed, has it?
Nothing's changed. No.
If you hand knit for people, people don't realise how many hours you have to spend knitting it. So if you get £1.93 an hour, I think that's very good.
I pay a lot more than that to my sample knitters, you know, that I pay people to knit samples for my books. It's not the equivalent of a proper employee wage, because it is something that they can do in their own time, whatever. But it's a hell of a lot more than that. I think about double that.
It's 0.004p per yard.
Is that what you get? Have you worked it out as an hourly rate?
Wow! And if for Rowan, that's how much I get.
0.004p
0.004p a yard.
a yard. That's
Or is it
ridiculous.
4p? No, wait a minute. It's 4p.
It's
4p a yard.
4p a yard. That's more like it. I've come across, well, I've been told something between 10 and 20 pence a yard. So Rowan are paying very low. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. That's a yard of knitting.
And they do it on a per yard basis. Yeah. So how much does it amount to for a typical garment, a sweater then? What's the...
Put it this way, I'm not doing it for the money.
No.
I'm doing it for the fame. I'm doing it for the fame, to have a name in the book, yeah. Probably 30 to 40 pounds a yard.
Really? Rachel, you really need to start doing sample knitting for me. I pay least £150 for a sweater. And
Yeah,
generally,
it's more complicated though.
true, say 150 for a sweater, or 200 if it's a real, like an all-over pair. I like it. 200. Yeah, there you go. You need to work for it.
How much? I could buy it.
No wonder people are eager to do it for me. But I'm still aware that's still less. It still works out at less than a standard minimum wage.
Oh yeah.
But
then it's that long before you get paid, you've forgotten about the amount of hours that you've put in, and you're just like, yeah.
it's the same though for designers designing for a magazine. The whole industry is artificially, in my opinion, artificially kept poor. People are deliberately kept poor in this industry, in my opinion. I get angry about it if I dwell on it for too long. So a designer is paid something in the region of £250 for a sweater design for a magazine. That includes knitting the sack, so they've got to design it and write the pattern and produce a sample for £250. Yeah, it's outrageous, isn't it? That's why I don't design for magazines anymore, because I'm not willing to participate in that exploitation, because I think that by participating I just perpetuate it, and it's why I consciously pay a lot more than most of the people do for sample knitting. That's why, because I think it's bad for us, basically. Pardon?
I should be doing it on principle.
I won't criticise anyone for the choices that they make. The yarn. Shetland wool, you know about Shetland. I don't need to tell you about Shetland, much about Shetland yarn, do I? Shetland wool comes from Shetland sheep, the tiny little sheep that live in the Shetlands. They live on poor pasture, it's poor pasture. This isn't very fertile land that we're talking about. The grass is poor, the conditions are harsh, it's very wet and very cold most of the year. It's because of the harshness of the conditions that the wool is apparently so good, because the sheep are so badly nourished or whatever, so little and poor, that they can't grow thick wool. It's good nutrition grows thick wool. It's because they're not well nourished and they have such a harsh time that their wool is so fine. That fineness is a result of that harshness of the climate there. It's some of the finest in the British Isles. I think it is, if we look at Bradford wool counts, it is the finest wool we have. I think Blueface Leicester comes close. It's probably our next best yarn. Sheep's wool, that is, fibre from sheep's wool in the UK. And apparently expert Shetland spinners could spin 6,000 yards of a 3-ply thread from 2 ounces of fibre. By ply, I mean, we're not talking there about the thickness of the yarn. By ply, we're talking about the number of threads, the number of single threads that are in the yarn. So it's what spinners refer to as a fold, a 3-fold yarn. So they've separately spun 2,000 yards of a very fine thread, and then they've plied that together with 2 more very fine threads. No, more than, isn't it? They've spun 6,000 yards separately, so it would be 18,000 yards, wouldn't it, if you take the plies apart? I'm confusing myself here.
3 lots of 16.
Yeah, 3 lots of 6 is 18, isn't it? So it's 18,000 yards of the single plies. Pardon? That's more than a mile. Is it? I don't know these things.
1,760.
Is it? Ah. So there's a mile. They can spin a mile of thread of the single ply from 2 ounce and a fibre, and then they combine it into a 3-ply thread.
So that's like 50 grams, isn't it, in today's
So
rates, is it?
it's 6,000 yards to 50 grams.
Fine, yeah.
About 50 grams. Was it about 55, something like that? That's very fine, isn't it? I read somewhere, I've not got it on here yet, that it's somewhere between 3 and 5 fibres in the spun single thread. In the spun singles, it was something between 3 and 5 fibres. Single fibres. So very fine. I've actually done that, believe it or not, because I am a spinner. I took a fine spinning class from a lady in the Bradford Guild. I couldn't do it consistently though. I could spin for a while and then it'd break. But I did get very fine, definitely between 3 and 5 fibres in the yarn that I was spinning. It's difficult though, very, very, very difficult. And I would have had to have had a hell of a lot of practice to be able to do it consistently. That's for the finest lace shawls. But for hat shawls, are you familiar with this term hat shawl, everybody? You should be by now, because Kate Davis has this new book out that is familiarising everybody with what this term is. The hat shawl is a more practical garment. So the fine lace shawl, knitted with this really fine thread, very fine wool. The fine lace shawls were for fashion, they were for elegance, they were for upper class ladies. Whereas hat shawls were knitted from thicker yarn. They were still lace, but they were knitted from thicker yarn, and they were practical, everyday garments created primarily for warmth. They were created for function rather than form. And the yarn for hat shawls could be anything up to a 4-ply weight yarn, more than 4-ply. It's called jumper weight in the Shetland Islands. This is what they used for knitting with. I don't know if you can see that very well. Can you see? It's a leather belt with a pad forming part of the belt. This big oval-shaped pad, and it's got lots of holes in it, and therefore sticking the end of a double-pointed needle into. I've never used one. I've been with somebody that's used. Have any of you used? Have you used one, Pam?
No, but I've seen quite a young girl when they have the festival, they also
The Edinburgh Wool Festival?
No, the festival proper.
Oh yeah, Edinburgh Festival, yeah.
And I've seen a girl, very young girl, using one of these.
Interesting. Yeah. Hazel Tyndall, do any of you remember the time that Hazel Tyndall came and was just attended our guild meeting here, world's fastest knitter? She uses a knitting belt because she's a Shetland knitter. This is, modern Shetland knitters use these as well. So they're still in use, whereas the knitting sticks that we had in Yorkshire have fallen out of use, whereas the Shetland knitters are still using these belts. They could work up incredible speed knitting with the end of their needle stuck in this. It meant that because the needle carrying the knitting, it was the passive needle that was in the knitting belt. Well, it'd be this side, wouldn't it? Left-handed. Being left-handed. It'd be on this side. The end of the double point would go in it, and it meant that Do you remember our earlier picture of the lady walking out with the creel on her back? Because it was the passive needle, the needle that was carrying the knitting that was in the belt, it meant that they could let go of their knitting whenever they needed to do whatever it was that they were doing, you know, to push a sheep out of the way or pat the cow on its way or whatever it was that they were doing, or dig that clod of peat out of the bog. Whatever it was that they needed to do, they could let go of the knitting and leave it there. They also had, I've not been able to find any pictures of these, but they also had hooks that they attached the end of the knitting to, so that it wasn't trailing on the ground as it got too long. They had a hook somewhere that they attached it to, and also I've read that the hook exerted some tension onto the knitting, that it put some pull onto the knitting away from the needle, which actually helped the speed of the knitting, apparently. I've no idea quite how that worked, but it helped the stitches to spring off the needle as they were being formed, which helped with the speed. And then the other thing is something to hold the yarn as well, a hook to hold the yarn. I don't know what they called them in Shetland, but here in Yorkshire we would call them a clue hook, a hook that you put your ball of yarn onto. It would be a centre pull ball, so that you're not having to have your ball rolling around all over the place on your knitting. So they'd have a centre pull ball. It would be held on a hook that would be attached again to this belt. So, oh, hang on. Sorry, my error again. That's it. We're on to the patterns. This is what Shetland Lace is known for. The actual knitting patterns, most of which have become pretty famous. I bet, has anybody here heard of cat's paw, that one at the top? You've all heard of cat's paw, pardon? I'm knitting it. You're knitting cat's paw at the moment, are you? Let's have a look. Don't just say it.
It's probably got mistakes in.
Oh, it's lovely. Can we pass it round?
Yeah. It's not very neat, so, you know.
Are you sure that's cat's paw? That looks to me like strawberry.
Oh, well,
That's, it is. Can you see at the top?
Yeah, I can
Six
see
holes
that.
in that cat's
Yes,
paw.
I can see
There's
that.
3 on each side. And in yours there's a hole at the bottom. That's
Yeah.
strawberry.
Okay.
Does it make sense to you why it's called strawberry?
Yes, it looks like a strawberry.
It looks like a strawberry. I can pass that around. I'm glad that you got that because I haven't actually put strawberry on here. There were just too many to go at. Although Mary Thomas says that there are only 10 lace patterns. That's many. I presume there's a back thing going on or something. Mary Thomas says in her book that there are only 10 actually native Shetland patterns. Maybe it's grown since then. I don't know. But at the time that Mary Thomas was writing, she says there were only 10 truly native Shetland patterns. These 4 are from that 10. Cat's paw is apparently truly native to Shetland. Was developed in Shetland. It's not something we've imported from elsewhere. Razor shell is a truly Shetland pattern. Old shale. You see this pattern on the left here. You see this little ridge in it? Traditionally it has that little curl ridge in it. So it's 3 rows of stocking stitch and a row of a ridge, a curl ridge in the old shale. Traditionally it's that 4 row pattern. Although they did vary it a lot in various ways. Extra rows of pearl, no rows of pearl at all. I happen to have with me a few garments with this. This pattern old shale was the most commonly used patterns in the hat shawls, the practical workday garments, so it was more typical to see that pattern used in heavier weights of yarns for the simpler shawls that were worn by the actual Shetland ladies themselves. And it was often whereas that's a single colour. It was often striped with other colours, or just striped with the different natural colours of the sheep. Have you all seen that there's a massive array of natural colours in Shetland sheep, going through from white to nearly black, and all kinds of brown shades in between, and brown and oranges in between. I've brought with me, this is my summer sheep sea shawl, and the edging on this is old shale except without the pearl ridge in it. So I'll pass this around for you to have a look at. The centre in this is small diamonds. It's called small diamonds, the pattern in the centre, except that that is not a native Shetland pattern. It's one that they do use in Shetland shawls. It's not one of the native ones. This is truer to the way that old shale was used in the hat shawls. This is my truly shawl, and you see this striping, the way that I've striped it with a different colour. So that's my interpretation of a hat shawl. Again, it's not got a pearl ridge in it. I've just done a plain stocking stitch old shale pattern for this, and then my edging. I'll pass that way on that way, shall I? Yeah. There are other variations. Some of you attended a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. I did a talk about feather and fan, which is what Americans called old shale, and all the variations that there are on it. And this is another, can you see the border on this, the scalloped border on this? This is another variation on old shale or feather and fan pattern. So I'll pass this around again as well. On, might be my next slide, we've got the pattern that's in the centre of this, which is leaf. And then horseshoe at the bottom. I'm sorry I've not got any examples of horseshoe pattern with me. I'll pass around the bit that goes with that shawl as well.
Can you tell me what yarn this is knitted in?
That one's Rowan fine lace. Dare I say Rowan? Well, which is a room. Not to know. But right. Can you see this pattern on the right hand side here? Leaf. That's not native, necessarily native to Shetland. I don't know if it's native to Shetland. It might be. It is one of the patterns in this book by Sarah Don, Shetland Lace, and I love it, this tiny little pattern. It also features in this book, The Magic of Shetland Lace Knitting by Elizabeth Loddy. There's a stitch, that these both include stitch dictionaries. The one in Elizabeth Loddy's book is excellent, it's an excellent stitch dictionary. So if you want to experiment with combining different Shetland lace patterns, this is the book that I would recommend that you get by Elizabeth Loddy. I believe it's available from her website. Lovely lady, very knowledgeable about Shetland lace. This is an excellent book. So I'll pass that way and that way through. And then this one in the centre, fur cone. I don't know if it shows up very well there. That it creates, it's a bit like a leaf shape, coming to a point at the top, this fur cone. And then Print of the Wave is one of the really famous Shetland lace patterns. There is, and you'll find pictures of it online, I've not got them here, somebody in Shetland has knitted themselves a fence with wire using Print of the Wave pattern. It's their garden fence is made of Print of the Wave pattern that is knitted with wire. It's excellent. It's really, really brilliant musical. These are some of the ground patterns. I really love this pattern on the left hand side, bird's eye. And then it's beams and there's faggoting. I brought with me just a pair of socks, purely because they've got two lines of faggoting, one at each side of the centre pattern here. So if you want to see what faggoting looks like. These patterns would be used to create the lace, the like background lace in a fine lace shawl. Any of these three lace patterns. Or to fill areas, small areas in the shawl, and to surround the larger knitted motifs. In a fine shawl, you get lots of wonderful combinations of knitted patterns. These two are getting to the more elaborate ones. This diamond Madeira and four-hole lace is one of the most elaborate Shetland lace patterns that I've ever come across. I love it. It's quite complex, isn't it? I used it to form the outer layer of this with a laptop case. So, which way shall I send this?
Can I put a light on while we're looking?
Yes, go
Just
on.
put one down at this end.
It's getting darker anyway, isn't it? Pass that way.
Can I just, I'm just looking at this one.
Yes.
This is the pattern that Cornelia Lee got completely wrong in 1947. She's, I was saying that there's a
That's the pattern that we got.
Cornelia Lee wrote a book of knitting patterns in 1847.
This is the pattern that she got wrong.
This is the one that Leslie O'Connor managed to figure out. At least, well, I mean, even when she figured it out, she hadn't really done it. Cornelia Lee hadn't really done it right. She had just made mistakes, but she hadn't got the so this is what it was supposed to do.
How bizarre! How very, very bizarre. Pam, is this your book? This is Sharon Miller's book, Heirloom Knitting, which I don't happen to own. So, I'm really jealous of Pam. Isn't that fantastic? Can I pass this round for people to look through? Pam, is that alright? Yeah. Pass that from Thank you very much. So these two here, the diamond Madeira and four-hole lace. Can you see the connection between the Madeira cascade and the Madeira? Can you see from what's on the left, which pattern on the right hand side is the Madeira diamond and four-hole lace? There we go. And then this is my my other favourite. I love this one because it's so feminine, isn't it? It's gorgeously feminine. I used this years ago. I expanded it. I can't remember what I did, whether I shrunk it or expanded it. I had to play a bit with pattern repeat to make it fit for this, with the edging that I've got on this shawl. This is my most popular lace shawl pattern. So, as you can see, all the things that I'm talking about, you see from my collection in which I have used different Shetland lace patterns. The classic Shetland lace garment is a square shawl. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the construction, how they are constructed. And this relates back to our picture from the beginning of the lady with the creel on her back. Why going to display? Those of you who were here at Mary's Orenburg lace talk, do you remember she had a slide, she showed you that the Orenburg shawls are knitted in one piece. The square is knitted in one, all in one piece. Cleverly turning corners and things like that. Oh! We'll get there. Whereas the Shetland lace patterns traditionally are knitted in pieces that are grafted together before finishing the shawl. And there's a practical reason for that. It is that the Shetland ladies were knitting on the move. While they were out and about doing their work, they took their knitting with them. And so they needed it to be in small, manageable pieces that they could, so they weren't weighed down with lots of knitting as they were going about their work. And so they weren't having to do rows with thousands of stitches in them as well. This is the process. Can you see here? The edging, the very outer edging, was knitted first. Pam's got. Can I hold your sample here, Pam? This is a naughty one. We'll pretend it's not. So I can talk about this. Can you see this very edging, this edge piece here? This edging. That's a knitted on edging. Have you gone round the shawl afterwards? Yes. Doing it in short rows, bringing in a stitch from the shawl at the end of each inward row or whatever. Right. So, along one side, they knit the edging, one edging for one side, and then they pick up stitches along the long edge of that edging that they've knitted. The edging is knitted in very short rows. It's a strip, a long strip, knitted in rows of, maybe 20 stitches in a row. So they pick up stitches along the selve edge of their knitted strip and knit the border. That's this section between the narrow edging and the centre square, the border. And that's knitted in long rows back and forth. You see the direction of the arrows in that bottom edging? So back and forth in long rows. And then there'd be a row of lace holes between that border and the centre square. They'd do a row of lace holes and knit that centre square. And then they'd knit the other three pieces, one at a time, knit those other three pieces and graft them to the centre square and to each other along those mitered, you see the mitered edges. They're very well grafted. However, Pam's cheated with this one. And she's followed the pattern and the pattern for this, and most modern patterns are like this now, because we don't like grafting and seaming, do we, ladies? No, we don't. So we knit a square to make the centre and pick up stitches around the centre square, and working on a long circular needle, we knit the borders outwards with increases at the corners to create the mitre at the corners, and then knitting around the whole thing at the end to add the edging is added last of all by knitting in a stitch from the borders at the end of every second row on the edging. Is that how you did it?
No, it's knitted on straight. It was knitted on straight needles for each side of the border is knitted. So there is some straight.
Oh, it's on straight needles. Is it more like Mary's? Was it like your embroidered lace construction, I wonder? Beautiful though, isn't it? So it's a hat style though, isn't it? It's a centre pattern with those cables, little cables, and it's old shale, and you can see it centres outwards, the old shale, because the holes point outwards rather than pointing inwards. And then it's lovely, and that's lovely how that there echoes the pattern in the centre, doesn't it? The cable running around there. Beautiful. Am I allowed to pass this round, Pam? Yes. Who would like, which way should it go? Go that way then. Thank you. Yes. Dressing them. Can you see this picture here of the lace of a wooden frame. It's a square wooden frame with pegs hammered into all along the laps that create the frame. There's pegs all along there. And they would thread cotton or whatever through the points of the edging on the shawl and round, so through a point, round a peg, through a point, round a peg, through a point, round a peg, to tension the shawl, the wet shawl, so this is the wet shawl that we're doing this, on the square frame, and then leave it to dry. And it's under so much tension that that stretches out the lace to show off the beauty of the lace. Those of you that have knitted lace know it's awful until it's stretched, isn't it? It just looks like a scrap of rubbish, doesn't it? Cheeseclothing, whatever, it's a right mess until it's stretched. I've never used one of these. Yeah, I've got a picture later on though, wait till we get there. You're more likely to do the way that I do it now is we use gym mats, buy foam gym mats and pins, long T-pins or large-headed pins, long T-pins and blocking wires. So you would push a blocking wire through the points at the edge of your shawl and then you would pin that blocking wire to the foam mat. That's how we do it in modern times. This wasn't the only way that they did it in Shetland. There was another way that they did that's quite amusing. Not everybody had a square frame or indeed space for a square frame in their tiny little croft. So instead, they would just use individual pegs to peg them out on the ground. Can you see there, they're not all square ones? You see, I'm sure there's a circular one in the centre there. Just off to the left. I read, but I'm not convinced from looking at that picture. I did read someone say that even though they were doing it by eye, pegging them out by eye, they were barely a fraction out from the actual square shape. I'm sorry, those don't look perfectly square to me. They look perfectly square. No. It's not that reliable a method, is it? They're just stretching them. This is Kate Davis. She had this square frame made especially for herself. So it's a traditional style square Shetland shawl frame. And this is her hat shawl that she designed for this. She said, look, it's only been out a couple of weeks, this book.
Have a quick look.
Yes.
Where did you buy it?
I ordered it from Kate. Online, you can order it online from Kate. She's done the traditional borders inwards method for this shawl. She wanted to do a traditional style, so it is a traditional borders inward method. I'm not sure, I've not read it properly, whether it's bordered inwards with actually grafted at the mitres or whether she's cheated and knitted it in the round. But it's a borders inwards design. And whereas on pams, I've ascertained this by looking carefully at the pictures, on pams, the points on the old shale, the holes on the old shale point outwards on the shawl, point to the edging. On Kate's, because it's borders inwards, the holes in the old shale point to the centre of the shawl. Then I've just got a few examples, and there are examples in the books that I'm going to pass around for you to look at. I've got a few examples of the fine lace shawls. And you see, they really, oh hang on, did it again. They really combine lots of different patterns in the edging, and I think it's probably cat's paw or something like it in the dips of the bins, and then that's fern or tree pattern. I'm not sure certain what that is near the centre. The diamond with a cat's paw in it, and I don't know what the centre pattern is at all. It could be just holy diamonds. It looks like a diamond with two holes near the top of each diamond to me. This one's more complex still. There's not enough detail for me to work out what the individual patterns are. But look, it's amazing, isn't it? I think, can you see what going around near the centre? Can you see some crowns? If you look through the Shetland, the Sarah Don's book, she's got patterns for some crowns. Have you spotted them? These that look like crowns on the wall. It's interesting with those. And then this one, can you see this one's got crowns again, but it's also got saltires. Can you see the saltires near the edging on that? And I love the zigzag border in that. That zigzag with lots and lots of strawberries running next to the zigzags. Absolutely gorgeous. I can see some Madeiras above it in the centre. That's a detail from a shawl that we got in the Shetland Museum. And I think that's maybe. That's it, folks. Did you bring some more shawls as well, Pam? I understood that you were bringing some. Plural.
I mean, I've got the shawls that I did and my sister did for my kids. So, this is the one I did when I was expecting my little boy, which is a sort of 30s version of Shetland Lace.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
And my sister knitted around her. This is from the 30s knitting book.
From a 1930s knitting.
Yeah, well, it's a book about 1930s knitting.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you sort of
No.
around you.
It's a hat, isn't it? It's a...
Yeah. I mean, if you just push it around you, you realise how warm it is. Which is why people use it.
Can you go straight through?
Yeah, go on, sorry.
And my sister actually knitted this. Although she broke her arm halfway, her wrist halfway through.
Oh my word, look at this.
And I've asked her to practice it more than once. They're slightly stained. That has been through 6 babies. It's been lent out, so it's been very good. This one I didn't dare because she knitted it to give it to anybody else. But I have knit a few of them in my time, and they've gone sort of into
You can see that that's printed.
Yeah.
Right, ladies, she's
She's given up knitting now. She's given up knitting now.
She's given up knitting. It's gorgeous.
That's it. So, I'm going to say goodbye.
Right, I've only got